Hello, friends, and let's get started.
They had dinner together every Wednesday night. Even if Maddie had a busy day, she always made time to get home on time. It was their little ritual. Jake would make a family recipe casserole, Maddie would bring a bottle of wine, and they'd have long conversations about work, friends, summer vacation plans. But in recent weeks, the ritual had cracked. That night, she'd been late for work. Jake left the casserole in the oven and sat down to watch the news. Half an hour, an hour and a half. Maddie didn't answer her texts. Her phone was on, but each time it rang all the way through and then went to voicemail. When she finally arrived, it was almost 9. No wine, no apology. She threw her bag on the floor, sat on the couch, and took off her shoes with relief. Sorry, got held up in a client meeting, she said, avoiding his gaze. You could have at least written, he remarked, opening the oven. The casserole had gone dry. He spread some out on 2 plates, set it in front of her. She nodded, took a fork, but barely ate. Jake didn't continue the conversation. After all, everyone has busy days. The next day, she came in late again. Friday too. By the end of the week, he knew something was wrong. On Saturdays, they usually went to the park, walking along the river, but this time Maddie said she was having brunch with her coworkers. Jake wondered why hadn't she mentioned it before, but all he said was, okay. I hope you have a great time. She left in the morning. Brunch was supposed to be over by noon. At 1 o'clock, he figured she was a little late. At 2, he texted her, everything okay? She didn't reply until 3. I'll be there soon. Brunch went a little long. Jake figured the coworkers were probably up to some sort of late lunch, and that was fine. But when she came back after 4, he felt slightly perplexed. Her hair was a little disheveled. Her face was flushed, and there was the subtle scent of someone else's perfume on the seat of the car. Jake noted it to himself, but decided not to make a fuss. Maddie threw a small bag of muffins on the table and said, a coworker's treat. Sorry it took so long. They have some interesting ideas for a new project. She smiled so naturally that he had no reason not to believe her. But that night, he couldn't sleep for a long time. His mind reeled with moments. Her new haircut, her recent purchases of expensive lingerie, those rare glances in her phone that she hid as if they were more than just work messages. And then there was that perfume, a sweet, almost floral scent he hadn't smelled before. That uneasiness brewing in him was still barely perceptible, like the hum of a distant train. But the longer he gazed out into the night city, the stronger the feeling became that this train was rushing straight toward them. The change started suddenly. Jake couldn't say it happened overnight, but one evening he caught himself thinking that a completely different Maddie was sitting next to him. She was staring at her reflection in the mirror, combing her hair for long periods of time, as if she were looking for something he didn't understand. A new color, a slight wave. It looked great, but it was more than just a desire to tidy up. It was like some kind of preparation. Maddie started ordering expensive cosmetics and lingerie online that he hadn't seen before. Her closet was replenished with things she would never have spent money on before. Maddie used to love comfortable and practical things, t-shirts, jeans, a simple cardigan. Now it was lacy lingerie, new shoes, tight dresses. A collection of creams, serums, and perfume bottles appeared on the bathroom shelf. Jake noticed that every morning she locked herself in the bathroom for a long time and then came out, all glowing, but almost immediately went to work. One day, he couldn't stand it. They were sitting on the couch, watching an old movie. Maddie touched his neck, adjusted a necklace he'd never seen before, and smiled involuntarily, as if thinking of something pleasant. Jake turned to her and asked, "Who are you trying so hard for?" Maddie raised her eyebrows in surprise. "For me. Can I look good for me?" She hummed slightly and turned back to the screen. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. Sure, everyone has the right to take care of themselves, but she'd never approached it so thoroughly before. Still, he tried to reassure himself. Perhaps she'd just found a new hobby, responding to the fashion for healthy living and self-care. He tried to let the thought go, but then there was the phone. In the morning, when he reached for her phone to check the time, the screen didn't light up. She always kept her phone unlocked. Her password was their wedding day, but now he couldn't get in. Password request. Maddie stood at the door with her coat on, getting ready for work. "Did you change the password?" Jake didn't even try to hide his surprise. Oh, yeah, I just thought I'd keep myself safe in case anything happened. She threw on a scarf and smiled. There are so many hackers in the world. When she left, Jake tried again. Same request. Before, her phone had always been in the kitchen or on the nightstand. Now she never let it out of her hands. Even at dinner, the screen was turned down. And when he tried to pick it up, she would immediately notice and ask, "What are you looking for?" "Nothing," he would answer, though everything inside was clenching. Then the name Lauren began to come up in their conversations. At first, it was a casual mention. "Lauren and I were discussing this project. Lauren recommended a great restaurant. Lauren is so funny. You should see her." The name kept coming up more and more. Jake thought it was a new co-worker, maybe a friend, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind the name. Sometimes, when they had breakfast together, she would glance down at her phone and grin. Jake noticed the corners of her lips turn upward as she stared at the screen. He knew they were messages, but he didn't ask who they were from. He had no right to be jealous, but he had every right to be concerned. One morning as Maddie hurried to work, Jake walked her to the door and suddenly asked, "Lauren, right? You two must be friends by now, huh?" She froze, standing in the doorway with her coat in one hand and her bag in the other. "We just get along well," she replied with a slight shrug, but he noticed her gaze linger on him for a split second, as if she was checking to see if he'd noticed something. "That's great," he said, but his voice sounded unnatural, and he knew it. After she left, he stood at the window for a long time, watching her get in her car, drive out of the yard, and disappear from sight. He was sure she was on her way to work. But what was growing inside him was something else. It wasn't suspicion. It was anxiety, a thick fog that slowly filled every corner of his mind. She had changed, and now there was something in her demeanor that he couldn't understand. Something it was as if she was purposely trying to hide. Jake sat in the kitchen for a long time that evening, thinking about everything that had happened in their lives in the last few weeks. He'd thought he knew Maddie better than anyone, but now that confidence had evaporated. Her eyes, her voice, even her gait, everything told him that something had changed. But what was it? The phone lay on the table in front of him. He wrote a message, trying to keep his tone calm. "How's work going?" The reply came almost immediately. Sitting with Lauren in the office, it was short, like everything was fine. But Jake felt something inside him tense up. He decided to check it out. He dialed the office number. A couple seconds of waiting, and the receptionist answered. "Hello, may I speak to Maddie?" The woman on the other end of the line faltered. "Maddie? She left 3 hours ago." There was silence in the room. Jake could hardly resist calling his wife back right away and asking where she really was. But what would he say? That he'd heard it from his secretary? Maddie would surely come up with an explanation. He hung up, put the phone on the table. He needed more information, more certainty. Not just suspicions, but facts. He was tormented by the thought of where she really was. Jake got in his car and drove past the office and then turned onto another street, picking a direction at random. He drove slowly, as if hoping he'd run into her by accident. And he did. Her car was parked on the corner near the bar. Her silhouette flashed through the door, with Lauren next to her. They got out, both laughing. Maddie said something, putting her hand on Lauren's shoulder, and Lauren responded with a smile. Both faces glowed with happiness. Jake watched without moving from his seat. They reached the car, opened the doors, and got in. The car started. Jake followed at a distance, trying not to get too close. They drove for a short time, turned into an unfamiliar neighborhood, and then disappeared behind the gates of a private house. He stopped across the street, watching the lights in the windows. He couldn't see exactly what was going on inside. His heart was beating frantically. He thought about what it all meant. Who was this Lauren to her? Why did they spend so much time together? Why was she lying about being at work? That night, he barely slept. In the morning, without saying anything, he installed a tracking app on her phone. It wasn't just suspicion, it was desperation. He needed to know the truth. The next time Maddie said she was staying at work, he turned on the app. The location showed a completely different address. Not the office. Lauren's house. Jake stared at the screen, unable to tear his eyes away. His breathing quickened, his thoughts jumbled. Everything he'd been trying to ignore for so long was now obvious. Maddie wasn't where she said she'd be, wasn't doing what she'd promised. And now he had proof. When the door opened, Jake was standing just inside the doorway, hands clenched in his pockets, as if trying to keep himself from moving. Maddie walked in, slowly, not even noticing him at first. She pulled off her coat, turned to the coat rack. The moment her fingers touched the shoulders, he spoke. "How was work?" He began with barely perceptible irony. I wondered since when it was held at Lauren's house. Her hand froze. Her breathing became slower, deeper. "Jake," she said softly, dropping the bag to the floor. "We need to talk." She walked around him, sat down on the couch, and dropped her head onto her palms, sighing heavily. The silence stretched like a rubber band until she finally spoke. "Jake, yes, I was with Lauren, but I didn't cheat on you. It's not like she's another man, so it's not cheating." He blinked, furrowing his brows, feeling his mind refuse to accept those words. He stepped closer, struggling to keep from raising his voice. "What? Were you with Lauren?" he asked, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" Maddie raised her eyes to his. There was sadness and regret in her gaze, but no fear. She knew the moment of explanation was inevitable. "I love Lauren and I slept with her," she said calmly, but not without an internal struggle. "But that doesn't mean I don't love you anymore." The phrase sounded like she was reading from someone else's letter. Jake froze. His shoulders tensed, his eyes widened. It took him a few seconds to understand her words, and then he took a step back as if she'd physically pushed him. "What did you say? Slept with Lauren?" he muttered, looking straight at her. "Are you serious?" Maddie lowered her gaze to her hands folded in her lap. She looked like someone who'd finally discovered a long-kept secret, but she wasn't happy about it. "Jake, I wanted to tell you for a long time, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how." His voice got louder. "You cheated on me, and now you're trying to portray it as some form of love." She raised her head sharply, looked him straight in the eye. "It wasn't betrayal," she blurted out. "I still love you. You're my husband. I didn't mean it, but it just happened and I liked it." Jake felt everything inside him turn upside down. Her words sounded like she was trying to justify the irreparable. He couldn't follow her logic. All he could think of was the chaotic, "She loves Lauren. She didn't cheat, but she did. She loves me." "You don't think that wasn't betrayal?" he asked, feeling his voice grow louder with each word. "You lied to me every day. Every day. And you're telling me that's not betrayal?" "I didn't know how to explain it to you." Maddie grabbed his hands, but he yanked them away quickly, as if he'd been burned. "Don't touch me." He cut her off, taking a step back. "You lied to me, and now you want me to believe that this is normal? That it's something less than cheating?" She was silent, head down. The few seconds lasted like an eternity. Maddie tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, she said quietly, "I didn't want you to find out this way." "How did you want to find out?" He interrupted, his voice sounding hoarse but powerful. "Were you just going to move on, pretend everything was fine until I'd come face to face with it?" She tried to object, but stopped herself, shook her head. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know it hurts." He turned away, his hand on his forehead, fingers squeezing his temples. For a moment, it looked like he was about to explode, but he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, facing the window. The rain behind the glass drummed on the sill, sounding like the rhythm of his frantically pounding heart. "I don't know what to do now," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "I can't believe it's all true." She got up from the couch, took a step toward him, but froze. "Jake," she started, but he held up his hand, stopping her. "Don't," he said without turning around. "Just not now. I need time." She stared at his back, feeling the words stick in her throat. Then she turned, walked silently to the door. Before she left, she turned around, but he was still standing there, staring out the window. She couldn't make him look back, couldn't say what he wanted to hear. Maddie left, closing the door behind her, leaving the house in complete silence. Jake lay awake all night. He lay in bed, staring into the darkness, where the outlines of the closet, the dresser, the pictures of them together on the wall were barely visible. None of that mattered anymore. At dawn, he was still in the same pose when he heard the front door open quietly. Her footsteps were cautious, as if she was afraid of waking him, but he didn't move. Only when he heard her carefully placing her keys on the table by the entrance did he turn his head. "I thought you were asleep," Maddie said. Her voice was hoarse, tired. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her hair was disheveled. Her makeup was gone, and her eyes were the same mixture of guilt and defiance as last night. How can you sleep after something like that? He replied, not even trying to hide his bitterness. Maddie lowered her gaze, hesitated for a second, then stepped closer. Jake, let's talk. I don't want to end like this. He grinned, but there was no joy in his grin, just tiredness. You don't want it to end like this? He rose slowly to his feet, looking her straight in the face. After everything you've done? She bit her lip, clearly gathering her thoughts. Then she took a deep breath and looked at him with the same expression that always confused him. There was no malice in her eyes, not even a pure lie. Just something complex, confusing that he couldn't understand. We could try. Another way, she finally said. What? His eyebrows went up. What are you talking about, Maddie? She nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, then sighed again. We could try a threesome. You're still my husband. Jake felt something inside him snap. He stared at her, and time seemed to stand still for a moment. Had she really just said that? Had he misheard her? A threesome? His voice sounded so deafening that even he hardly recognized himself. Are you serious right now? Maddie swallowed, but there was no doubt in her gaze. Lauren's okay with it, she said quietly. Jake blinked, then laughed. It was a short, harsh laugh that didn't have an ounce of mirth in it. He shook his head slowly. Lauren's okay with it, he repeated, as if tasting the words. Maddie took a step closer, but he raised his hand, making her freeze. You cheated on me, lied to me. His voice was steady, but there was tension in it, ready to explode. And now you come in here and offer me some kind of damn compromise? Like this is a business deal? It's not a deal, Jake. Her voice was pleading. I don't want to lose you. We can find a way. Find a way. He interrupted her, feeling his heart pounding so hard it was about to burst his chest. Do you even hear yourself? Do you think I could live in such a farce? She bit her lip, her eyes glistening. It's not a farce, Jake. I don't want to lose you. I love you. Do you love me? He stepped closer, feeling the storm raging in his chest. So much that you cheated on me? So much that you suggested I share you with someone else? She squirmed, but didn't look away. It's not that simple. No, it's very simple. His voice trailed off, and he took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together. You've made your choice, Maddie. Now it's my turn. She opened her mouth, but didn't have time to say anything. He turned, walked to the bedroom, grabbed his travel bag, and started throwing things into it. Shirts, jeans, a couple of t-shirts. He didn't think, didn't calculate, just knew. He couldn't stay here with her. Maddie stared at him, her eyes widening with every movement of his hands. Jake! Her voice was quiet, broken. No, Maddie. He zipped up his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for the door. You think you can hold on to both me and her? That I'll be able to live with it? But I can't. She took a step as if she was going to grab his hand, but froze. I'm sorry, she whispered. He stopped in front of the door, put his hand on the knob, but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he echoed. You have no idea what that word even means. And without waiting for an answer, he opened the door and walked out, slamming it loudly behind him. Jake threw the bag into the trunk of the car and got behind the wheel. He stopped for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tight his fingers turned white. Everything he'd built, everything he believed in, was crumbling. His world seemed to be shattering, and he just didn't know which end to start picking up the pieces. The engine started, and he drove out into the street without a clear plan. Just drove forward, away from the house where the woman he loved so much and hated so painfully at this moment remained. He felt nothing at first, just the cold inside and the sound of the rain pounding on the roof of the car. Jake just stared at the road, not turning on his music, not answering his cell phone. He drove in silence, getting farther and farther away from the place he called home yesterday. After a few hours, ending up at a small motel off the highway, he pulled over. Taking the room key, he climbed the creaky stairs. Closing the door behind him, he threw his bag on the floor and collapsed on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. A storm of emotions was brewing inside him. Rage, sadness, longing, but most of all, a deep, painful sense of betrayal. Jake closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Images came to him. Maddie laughing at their wedding, Maddie jumping for joy when they bought the house, Maddie whispering in his ear how much she loved him. But then, like an old tape, the footage changed. Her insincere smiles, furtive glances at her phone, mentions of Lauren. Jake realized he couldn't just erase those memories. They were embedded in his mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. He spent the next few days in the motel, rethinking his life. He called a few friends, but he didn't tell anyone the truth. Just a little trouble at home. He waved it off to avoid long conversations. He thought about whether he should go back, whether he should give her a chance. But every time he pictured them together again, he felt like he couldn't forget her words or her actions. The betrayal was too deeply rooted to be displaced. Maddie called several times. At first he ignored her calls, then he started listening to the voicemails. Her voice sounded fainter and quieter each time. "Jake, I know how I ruined everything, but I really want to talk. You're the most important thing in my life." But Jake didn't call back. He felt that words wouldn't change anything else. She had made her choice, and he must now make his. On the fourth day, sitting in a small roadside diner, Jake felt something like relief for the first time. He was no longer replaying everything that had happened in his head. He was starting to think about what to do next. This small moment of calm had been a turning point for him. He knew that what lay ahead would be difficult. That would be rebuilding a life from scratch. But he decided he could handle it. A week later, Jake rented an apartment in another part of town, away from their shared home. It was a small, modest dwelling, but it became his new starting point. He began devoting more time to work, signing up for sports. He avoided mutual friends so he wouldn't hear questions about Maddie. He wasn't looking for a new relationship. He wasn't trying to fill the void with someone else. He was just trying to find himself. And Maddie, she stayed in their house. She tried to contact him a few times, but soon realized he wasn't coming back. Lauren remained in her life, but even with her, their relationship was different. Their closeness had lost the passion that had once seemed important to her. Maddie often thought about how things would have turned out if she'd had an honest conversation with Jake sooner. If she hadn't hidden her phone, if she hadn't gone out in the evenings, if she hadn't lied. But those were just thoughts now. There was no way to win back his trust. Jake never saw Maddie again. Years later, he occasionally heard about her from mutual acquaintances, but he never sought her out. For him, that chapter was closed forever. He no longer tried to figure out her motives, no longer tried to justify her actions. He just moved on. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.